The signal arrived on a Tuesday. Not with fanfare. Not with the coordinated global broadcast humanity had rehearsed for in 100 sci-fi simulations. It came in through the Atacama Large Millimeter Array in Chile at 3:47 Universal Time Coordinated, buried inside what the overnight operator initially flagged as atmospheric noise. 3 minutes of compressed, repeating binary. Play. Intentional. Dr. Amara Osebansu, senior signal analyst for the SETI Collaborative, was the first human being to look at the decoded output and understand what she was seeing. She did not call the press. She called her supervisor. Her supervisor called the UN Scientific Liaison Office. The UN called 12 governments simultaneously. It took 47 hours for the existence of the signal to leak. By then, the Joint Astronomical Verification Council had already confirmed what no one wanted to say out loud. The signal originated from a spacecraft. Not a probe. Not a relay beacon. A crude vessel, moving at approximately 0.3% of the speed of light, decelerating toward the outer solar system. Mass estimates from Doppler shift analysis suggested something between 800,000 and 1.2 million metric tons. To put that in context, the largest vessel ever constructed by humanity at that point was the ISS Extended Platform, at approximately 500 metric tons. The alien ship was, conservatively, 2,000 times more massive. The public was told there had been a significant astronomical development requiring international coordination. That lasted about 6 hours before independent astronomers in Japan, South Africa, and Finland all independently corroborated the data and posted their findings online. The internet didn't explode with panic. It exploded with something more complicated, a feverish, anxious curiosity, the kind that grips people when they realize the world they woke up to is not the same world they will go to sleep in. Governments scrambled. The messaging was fractured, contradictory, and in several cases openly dishonest. 3 heads of state gave press conferences calling for calm while their militaries were quietly placed on elevated alert postures. The U.S. Space Command issued a classified internal assessment within 72 hours of the signal's confirmation. The assessment's executive summary, later declassified following the war, contained a sentence that became grimly famous. "We cannot determine intent and we should not assume benevolence." It was the most important sentence written in the 21st century. Almost no one acted on it. What followed was 11 months of cautious, painstaking communication. The aliens, later designated the Keth by the academic community, derived from a phonetic approximation of the repeated identifier in their transmissions, were patient correspondents. Methodical. They responded to mathematical frameworks first, then moved gradually into symbolic language. Human linguists, computational models, and a rotating team of specialists worked around the clock to build a mutual vocabulary from first principles. The Keth were willing. Cooperative even. They shared data on their propulsion systems. Nothing actionable but enough to confirm they had solved certain energy problems that humanity had only theorized about. They described their social structure in broad strokes. They acknowledged that they had been observing the solar system for a long time. That phrase, a long time, was the first thing that quietly disturbed certain analysts. The question of how long was never answered directly. But the mood on Earth was largely optimistic. The Keth vessel had settled into a stable position near Jupiter's L4 point. They had made no aggressive moves. They had responded to every communication. Editorials across the globe declared it a new chapter for the species. Several major religions issued theological statements. The UN fast-tracked the creation of a First Contact Diplomatic Council, which spent 4 months arguing over its own charter. The military analysts, meanwhile, kept running numbers that didn't look good. A vessel of that mass, traveling at those speeds, with propulsion systems of that efficiency, the Keth were not a young spacefaring civilization. They were not neighbors who had just figured out radio. Whatever they were, they had been doing this for a very long time. The question wasn't whether they were more advanced than humanity. That much was obvious. The question was, what did they want? The first formal diplomatic exchange, a face-to-face transmission with visual contact, happened 14 months after the signal. Humanity saw the Keth for the first time. The reaction was complicated. They were not monstrous. They were not comfortingly humanoid. They were something in between, something that pressed on the mind in a way that was difficult to articulate. What struck the lead diplomat, Ambassador Yuki Tanaka, most was not their appearance. It was their eyes. They weren't curious, she wrote in her classified debrief, which was not released until years later. I've spoken to scientists, explorers, children seeing the ocean for the first time. Curiosity has a quality to it. What I saw in those faces wasn't curiosity. It was something closer to an assessment. The exchange went well officially. The Keth expressed interest in establishing a formal information-sharing framework. They proposed coordinates near Mars orbit for a future in-person meeting. They used a phrase in their language that the translation team rendered as mutual understanding leading to resolution. Resolution of what exactly was left unspecified. 14 days after that exchange, a second Keth vessel entered the outer solar system. Then a third. By the end of the month, the Joint Space Monitoring Network had confirmed 11 distinct vessels on inbound trajectories, all larger than the first. The Keth, when asked about this through the established communication channel, offered a single response before going silent for 9 days. The translation read, "The arrangement requires witnesses." No one knew what the arrangement was. What followed was 6 weeks of silence, repositioning, and a creeping collective human dread that no official statement could fully suppress. The 11 ships did not accelerate toward Earth. They simply settled. Moved into positions that, when plotted on a system map, looked disturbingly like a cordon. Then the Keth fleet opened a new channel. And they made their offer. It was not what anyone had prepared for. It was not hostile in its language. It was, in fact, phrased with considerable diplomatic care. But the content, the actual substance of what they were proposing, was so staggering, so casually absolute in its implications for the human species, that the First Contact Diplomatic Council sat in complete silence for nearly 4 minutes after the translation was read aloud. The Keth were not asking for territory. They were not asking for resources. They were not asking for submission in any traditional sense. They were asking humanity to stop expanding, to stop transmitting, to decommission all deep space infrastructure beyond low Earth orbit within a defined timeframe, to accept a permanent boundary, monitored, enforced, around the solar system. Humanity, they explained, had been assessed. The assessment was complete. The conclusion was that humanity represented an unacceptable variable in what the Keth called the long arrangement, a phrase that appeared to describe some form of interstellar order, the exact nature of which they declined to elaborate on. They gave Earth's governments 90 days to respond. Ambassador Tanaka's private notes from that day contained 4 words. "They've done this before." She was right. They had. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The document was 43 pages long when fully translated. It had taken 3 weeks, 2 independent translation teams, and a specialized AI linguistic model trained entirely on Keth communication patterns to produce a version that the First Contact Diplomatic Council was confident enough to call authoritative. Even then, certain passages carried confidence ratings below 60%. Words that the translation model kept flagging as culturally embedded, terms that had no clean human equivalent. The working title given to the document by the Council's administrative staff was the proposal. Within the classified briefing channels of a dozen governments, it was called something else, the ultimatum. What the Keth were offering was, on its surface, a negotiated coexistence. Humanity would retain full sovereignty over Earth and the Moon. The document explicitly guaranteed non-interference with Earth's internal governance, culture, and biological development. In exchange, all human presence beyond the lunar sphere would be withdrawn within 4 years, all deep space communication arrays would be decommissioned or repurposed within 7, and all ongoing interplanetary missions, including 3 crewed Mars installations housing a combined population of 847 people, would be recalled. The monitoring framework was described in considerable detail. The Keth proposed an exclusion boundary at approximately $1.20, beyond which any human-made object would be considered a treaty violation. They offered to provide detection infrastructure themselves, small automated relay stations positioned in the outer solar system that would, in effect, serve as a permanent surveillance net around Earth. They called this protective oversight. The document's language was careful and, in places, almost kind. It acknowledged humanity's achievements. It referenced Earth's cultural and biological diversity as a noted characteristic. It described the Keth's own history in vague, broad terms, suggesting a civilization that had passed through something analogous to humanity's current developmental period and had, through the long arrangement, found stability. The phrase long arrangement appeared 19 times in 43 pages. It was never fully defined. When the Council's communication team submitted 14 specific clarifying questions about it, the Keth responded to 11. The remaining 3, all variations of who else is part of this arrangement, and did they agree to it voluntarily, received a standard response that translated roughly as outside the scope of current dialogue. That non-answer was the subject of an emergency closed session of the UN Security Council that lasted 11 hours. The public knew none of this. Officially, the First Contact Diplomatic Council was engaged in constructive dialogue with the Keth delegation. Officially, there was no cause for alarm. The 11 Keth vessels in the outer solar system were described in public briefings as a diplomatic escort fleet, a framing that was technically not false and functionally deeply misleading. Behind closed doors, the picture was very different. The military assessment had hardened considerably over the past 3 weeks. The Joint Space Monitoring Network had now confirmed that the Keth vessels were not simply parked. They were in a slow, continuous repositioning, micro-adjustments that, when modeled over time, traced the outline of a containment arc from the inner system's perspective. The lead analyst at Space Command, a quiet, precise woman named Colonel Dina Farrokhzad, presented her findings to the Joint Chiefs with a single slide that showed the projected final positions of all 11 vessels. They formed a shell. Not an attack formation. A monitoring perimeter. Positioned with fields of view that, when combined, gave total coverage of all plausible outbound trajectories from the inner solar system. No rocket launched from Earth, Moon, Mars, or any of the belt installations could exit the solar system without passing within detection range of at least 2 Keth vessels. "They're not threatening us," Colonel Farrokhzad said. "They're caging us." The distinction, several people in the room noted, mattered less than it appeared to. The 90-day response window created a strange paralysis. Governments that might ordinarily posture aggressively in a crisis found themselves with nothing to posture against. The Keth had made no hostile move. There was no inciting incident, no violation to respond to, no clear enemy action. What existed was an offer, politely delivered, backed by the implicit weight of 11 warships more massive than anything in the human inventory. There were voices that argued for compliance. Not from weakness, they insisted, but from realism. The Keth were demonstrably more advanced. Their fleet represented a technological gap that humanity could not plausibly close in any relevant timeframe. The Mars installations could be evacuated humanely. Deep space infrastructure could be rebuilt, eventually, once a more stable diplomatic relationship was established. The boundary wasn't permanent, it was a starting point. The document itself contained language suggesting review processes. Those voices were not wrong about the power differential. They were wrong about the document. It was Dr. Priya Subramaniam, a linguist and xenocultural analyst attached to the council, who found the passage that changed everything. It was in section 31, a dense paragraph about the historical precedent for the Keth's approach. The passage described, briefly, almost as an aside, the outcomes of previous arrangement proceedings with other species. The translation was fragmentary in places, but one clause survived with a confidence rating of 94%. It read, "In cases where the unincorporated species failed to achieve voluntary compliance, the arrangement was resolved through other means which are not discussed in this document." Dr. Subramaniam flagged it with a single annotation. Ask them how many times this has happened before. The council submitted the question. The Keth responded in 11 minutes, faster than any previous reply. The answer was a number. 47. 47 previous species had received arrangement proceedings. The Keth did not specify how many had complied voluntarily. They did not specify what resolve through other means looked like. They simply provided the number and noted that the long arrangement had been stable for what translated, imprecisely, as approximately 60,000 years. Dr. Subramaniam's next annotation read, "We are not the first. We may not be the last. But we need to understand if any of the 47 are still out there, and in what condition." No one slept well that night. The response deadline was now 61 days away. In Geneva, the First Contact Diplomatic Council convened its most consequential session. Every permanent Security Council member sent their head of state or direct equivalent. The session was held under a communications blackout so complete that even the cleaning staff was replaced by cleared personnel for the duration. The question on the table was not whether to accept or reject the Keth's offer. The question, the real question, the one that several leaders had been avoiding for weeks, was whether humanity had any options at all. The answer, when every classified military and intelligence assessment was laid on the table, was bleak. Conventional military options against a fleet of that mass and apparent capability were not viable. Economic leverage didn't exist in any meaningful form. Stalling through prolonged negotiation was possible but only bought time, not outcomes. But one option remained, not a military option, not a diplomatic one, a scientific one. It had been proposed quietly 2 weeks earlier by a small team at a research facility in New Mexico. They had been studying the Keth's propulsion signature, the specific emission profile of their drive systems, and they had noticed something. An anomaly. A pattern in the way the Keth vessels maneuvered that suggested their systems had a dependency. A shared infrastructure requirement. The team's lead researcher had written a short memo. It was 3 paragraphs. The final paragraph ended with a question. If their vessels draw from a common network architecture, and the emission data suggests they do, then the network has a topology. And topologies have vulnerabilities. We haven't built a weapon, but we may have found a pressure point. The question is whether we're willing to use it and what using it would cost us. The memo was classified at the highest level. It was also copied to every head of state in the room. The session lasted 14 hours. When it ended, no public statement was issued. No formal response was sent to the Keth. But a second memo went out to 12 research teams on 4 continents. It contained a single instruction: find out if it's real. You have 60 days. The clock was running. The Keth did not wait for the deadline. Day 43. The signal that came through the established communication channel at 6:12 Universal Time Coordinated was not a message. It was a notification. A status update, delivered with the same clinical tone as every Keth transmission before it, measured, precise, entirely without detectable emotion. The translation: voluntary compliance period adjusted. New terms follow. The new terms were not an escalation of the offer. They were a withdrawal of it. The boundary was the same. The monitoring framework was the same. But the timeline had been compressed from 4 years to 14 months. The review clause, the one paragraph in the original document that suggested future renegotiation was possible, had been removed. And a new section had been added, comprising exactly 2 sentences. Resistance to arrangement proceedings will result in demonstration of capability. Demonstration of capability is not negotiation. It is instruction. The Council's linguist team debated the translation for 40 minutes. Some felt demonstration was too soft, that the Keth word used carried a harder meaning, closer to proof or illustration through action. Others argued the distinction was academic. The distinction stopped being academic 18 hours later. The Keth vessel designated Track 7 by the Joint Monitoring Network, positioned roughly at the Mar-Sun L5 point, well outside the inner system, fired something. The emission was not consistent with any weapon profile in the Human Intelligence Database. It was a beam of some kind, extremely narrow, operating in an energy range that the monitoring network sensors had not been calibrated to detect at high resolution. It hit the Mars installation Delta-1 habitat module. The module housed 312 people. The beam was active for approximately 0.4 seconds. The rescue and recovery assessment, compiled over the following week, was never fully declassified. The summary that was eventually released stated only that Delta-1 suffered catastrophic structural failure resulting in total loss of life. The language was bureaucratic. It was chosen carefully to avoid describing what the beam had actually done to the structure, and to the people inside it. The other 2 Mars installations evacuated within 48 hours. The 535 survivors were en route to Earth before any government had issued a public statement about what had happened at Delta-1. The official public statement, when it came, described a tragic incident involving an uncontrolled structural event at the Mars installation, likely related to ongoing geological monitoring activity. It was the most transparent lie in the history of modern governance, and approximately no one believed it. Independent journalists, amateur astronomers, and a network of retired military analysts had already assembled enough fragments from public data, the emission signature, the timing, the sudden evacuation of the other Mars installations, to publish a picture that was, in all essential respects, accurate. The Keth had fired on a human habitat. 312 people were dead. The public response was not panic. It was something quieter and in some ways harder to manage, a cold, spreading fury. Protest movements that had existed at the fringes of political life, warning about the dangers of the first contact process, doubled and then tripled in size overnight. Military recruitment inquiries across every spacefaring nation spiked by percentages that the processing systems hadn't been designed to handle. In online forums, in mosques and churches and university lecture halls, in the comment threads of every major news platform on Earth, a single question repeated itself in 10,000 languages and 100 variations. What are we going to do? The governments didn't answer publicly. They were too busy trying to absorb what came next. Because Delta-1 was not the only target. Over the following 72 hours, the Keth fired 6 more times. The targeting was precise and, in retrospect, deliberate in its logic. They did not hit cities. They did not hit Earth. Every strike was on infrastructure beyond the lunar sphere: relay stations, deep space monitoring arrays, 2 automated cargo vessels, and a research platform in the asteroid belt housing a crew of 29. The strikes were spaced apart, unhurried, one approximately every 11 hours, as if the Keth were waiting between each to observe the human response before deciding whether to continue. Total human deaths in the 72 hours following Delta 1. 847 on the initial strike, combined with 312 from Delta 1. The exact figure, 1,159 dead, became briefly famous as the first official count. It was not the last count. It was barely the beginning. Because on day 49, the Keth changed their targeting logic. No one understood the shift immediately. The strike on that day hit a relay station near the asteroid belt, same as before. But 3 hours later, a second strike hit a civilian communications satellite in high Earth orbit. Not a military asset. Not a research installation. A satellite operated by a private telecommunications firm, providing internet access to parts of sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. It served no military purpose whatsoever. The Keth offered no explanation. Over the next 11 days, they hit 7 more civilian infrastructure targets. The pattern was indecipherable. A weather satellite. A commercial launch platform in the Pacific. A deep-sea cable relay station, not even a space asset, struck by a beam from orbit. Each strike was precise. Each strike appeared designed to cause infrastructure failure rather than maximum casualties. But each one killed people. Maintenance crews. Ground station operators. 13 people on a vessel that happened to be passing within the blast radius of the launch platform. The running death toll passed 3,000. Then 5,000. The strikes continued every 2 to 4 days. Governments that had been holding the diplomatic channel open with one hand and running classified research programs with the other were now under a different kind of pressure. The research program in New Mexico, the one looking for the pressure point in the Keth network architecture, had been running for 31 days. They had made progress. Not enough. Not yet. But the Keth weren't done changing tactics. Day 61. 1 day before the original deadline. At 14:30 Universal Time Coordinated, all 11 Keth vessels moved simultaneously, the first coordinated movement of the fleet since their arrival. They did not move toward Earth. They moved toward each other, contracting the perimeter arc slightly, repositioning into a new configuration that every analyst described the same way: tighter, more focused. The gap in their coverage that had previously existed over the solar system's southern ecliptic had closed. The message that came through the communication channel 4 hours later was short. 8 words in translation. Response period concluded. Arrangement will now proceed as designed. What followed over the next 6 weeks was not a war, precisely, not in any shape that matched humanity's existing frameworks for war. There were no declared hostilities. No ultimatums crossed. No battle lines drawn. What happened was systematic, methodical, and horrifyingly patient. The Keth began a campaign that military analysts would later describe as capability suppression, a term that sanitized something that was, in human terms, a slow-motion atrocity. They targeted communications infrastructure, power systems, satellite networks, ports, a water purification facility in Egypt that happened to rely on a satellite-guided control system, a flood management network in Bangladesh, a medical supply chain monitoring hub in Brazil. They were not trying to kill people directly. They were dismantling the connective tissue of a civilization. But people died anyway. They died in hospitals when power failed. They died in coastal zones when early warning systems went dark. They died of entirely preventable causes because the systems that had kept them alive were being quietly, surgically removed from the equation. By the end of week 4, the running death count was approaching 400,000. By the end of week 8, it had passed 2 million. The governments of Earth had, by this point, abandoned any pretense of a diplomatic solution. The communication channel with the Keth was still open, technically. But the last substantive response from the Keth had been that 8-word message. Every subsequent communication from Earth went unanswered. Dr. Subramaniam, still working within the Council, submitted a final linguistic analysis on day 79. It was 3 pages. The conclusion read: "The Keth have not stopped talking to us because they are angry or because they feel diplomacy has failed. They have stopped talking to us because, from their perspective, there is nothing more to say. The arrangement in their framework is proceeding. They are not in a conflict. They are completing a process. Understanding this distinction is not academic, it is the most operationally important thing we know about them. They are not trying to defeat us. They believe the outcome is already determined. The only way to change their behavior is to make them wrong about that. The New Mexico team had been running for 73 days. They sent their report on day 80. The death count by that morning was 4.3 million. The report was 300 pages long. The executive summary was one paragraph. It read, "The vulnerability is confirmed. The delivery mechanism is theoretical but buildable in a time frame of 4 to 7 months with existing infrastructure. The effect, if successful, would be total." We want to be clear about what total means in this context. We are not describing a weapon in any conventional sense. We are describing an intervention at the network level. The Keth fleet does not operate as 11 independent vessels. It operates as one distributed system. If the network fails, the vessels fail. All of them. Simultaneously. There will be no survivors on those ships. We estimate combined crew between 40,000 and 90,000 individuals. We are not recommending this course of action. We are reporting that it is possible. The decision belongs to someone else. The death count was 4.3 million. 9 million was still ahead. The facility didn't have a name on any public record. It appeared in internal budget documents as Project Infrastructure Node 7, a designation deliberately bland, nested inside a line item for orbital debris management research. It occupied a converted mining complex in northern Canada, 340 meters underground, accessible by a single unpaved road that showed up on satellite imagery as a logging track. 41 people worked there. The average age was 34. Every person on the team had been recruited by personal approach. No public posting, no institutional channel. Their selection process had been described to each of them as a research opportunity of exceptional national importance. None of them had been told before they arrived what they were actually building. The project lead was Dr. Oren Shapiro, a computational physicist who had spent 12 years studying distributed system architectures, specifically, the failure modes of large-scale networked infrastructure under cascading stress. He had written his doctoral thesis on how complex systems collapse. He had never imagined his work would be applied to anything beyond power grids and telecommunications networks. The Keth fleet, his team had determined, was not 11 ships. It was a single machine. The discovery had emerged from a meticulous analysis of the fleet's operational patterns over 4 months of observation. The Keth vessels never moved randomly. Every repositioning was coordinated to a degree that exceeded what could be explained by standard tactical doctrine. Response times between vessels, measured in milliseconds, were far too fast for crew-initiated communication. The fleet moved with the reflexes of a single organism, not a coordinated group. The propulsion signatures confirmed it. Each vessel's drive operated on a cadence that was fractionally synchronized with the others, a timing offset of 0.003 seconds, consistent across all observed maneuvers. That offset was the fingerprint of a real-time network handshake. The vessels were in continuous, active communication at a level below anything humanity had previously detected because it operated in a frequency range that human sensor arrays weren't designed to monitor. The Keth fleet was a distributed computing system housed in 11 separate hulls. That meant it had latency. It had bandwidth constraints. It had topology, meaning there were nodes, and nodes had relative importance, and importance created hierarchy, and hierarchy created a point of highest leverage. What the team at Node 7 was building was not, strictly speaking, a weapon. It was an intrusion tool. A signal, crafted with extraordinary precision, designed to enter the Keth network through its own communication protocols and propagate through the system in a way that exploited the architecture's dependency structure. The mechanism was elegant in the way that the most dangerous things often are. Every distributed system, when it needs to coordinate simultaneous action across all nodes, relies on a synchronization pulse. A master timing signal that tells every component in the network where it is in the operational cycle. Without synchronization, a distributed system becomes incoherent. The nodes begin operating on different assumptions about shared state. The system doesn't just slow down. It fails. What the Node 7 team had engineered, after 4 months, 840 terabytes of signal analysis, and a theoretical framework borrowed from an obscure branch of network topology mathematics, was a synthetic synchronization pulse. Indistinguishable, they believed, from the Keth fleet's own master timing signal. Identical in frequency, modulation pattern, and amplitude. But carrying a payload. A small, embedded recursion in the timing signal structure that would cause every node receiving it to enter a synchronization verification loop, a check-in-recheck cycle that was a standard component of the Keth's own error correction protocol. The verification loop on its own was harmless. But the synthetic pulses payload was designed so that the verification loop would call the synchronization signal again, which would trigger another verification loop, which would call the signal again. In network engineering, this was called a synchronization storm. It was the digital equivalent of a feedback loop with no exit condition. The Keth fleet's distributed computer, all 11 vessels simultaneously, would enter a recursive failure cascade and be unable to exit it. Every process dependent on synchronized timing would become incoherent. Navigation, targeting, life support, drive control. The team's models estimated total system failure within 90 to 140 seconds of signal reception. There were two problems. The first was delivery. The synthetic pulse needed to enter the Keth network through a node that the network trusted. It couldn't be transmitted from Earth. The fleet sensors would identify the signal's origin as non-Keth and filter it before it reached the network layer. The pulse needed to appear to come from inside the fleet, which meant it needed to be transmitted from somewhere that the fleet sensors would associate with a valid network source. The only valid network sources were the relay stations the Keth had positioned in the outer solar system as part of their proposed monitoring framework. Stations they had deployed unilaterally, without human agreement, as a demonstration of intent during the arrangement proceedings. The stations were automated. They were small. And they were, the Node 7 team had determined, connected to the fleet's network. Getting a transmission device to one of those stations undetected was not a trivial problem. The second problem was the decision itself. 47,000 crew minimum. Potentially 90,000. Non-combatants unknown. The Keth had never provided crew manifests and the fleet's mass estimates couldn't distinguish between crew and equipment. They might be warriors. They might be scientists. They might include individuals who had never chosen to be part of this mission, who had been assigned, conscripted, born into service. The team at Node 7 was required, by the terms of their project authorization, to present their findings to a specific review panel. The panel met on day 87 of the project, in a secure room in Geneva. The death count was 6.1 million. The review panel spent 3 days in closed session. External experts were brought in, ethicists, international law specialists, military strategists, 2 former heads of state. The sessions were later described by a participant as the most difficult conversations I have ever sat in, bar none. The counterargument to action was not that the Keth didn't deserve consequences. It was more subtle than that. If the intervention worked, the result would be the total destruction of an entire fleet, potentially the entirety of the Keth military capacity sent to this region, representing a significant fraction of a spacefaring civilization's forward-deployed force. The Keth, wherever their homeworld was, would receive the news eventually. The question was what they would do about it. Would it end the conflict? Or would it mark the beginning of a larger one? The military strategist on the panel, a retired general named Marcus Abra, summarized the strategic calculus in a way that cut through the theoretical framework. We don't know if there are more ships where these came from. We don't know how far away home is. We don't know if this is their primary force or an advanced deployment. What we know is that they're killing 9 million people and counting, and we have one plausible way to stop it. The question isn't whether we should use it. The question is whether we can live with ourselves if we don't. The death count was 6.8 million when the panel reached its conclusion. The decision was not unanimous. 3 of the 11 panel members dissented, all on the grounds that the action crossed a line that humanity, once crossed, could not uncross. Their dissent was recorded formally and has been preserved in the historical record. The 8 who voted for authorization did so knowing they might be wrong about everything, about the vulnerability, about the delivery, about the consequences. But they voted. The authorization was signed at 23:14 Universal Time Coordinated on a Wednesday. The team at Node 7 had 4 months to solve the delivery problem. They solved it in 3.5. It weighed 4.3 kilograms. The designation on the project manifest was Probe Unit Kestrel 1, another deliberately uninteresting name. In the informal language of the Node 7 team, it was called the Dart. It was 23 centimeters long, 8 centimeters in diameter, and constructed almost entirely of materials that would produce minimal reflective signature against the background infrared of deep space. Getting it to the Keth relay station designated KRS-4, positioned at the boundary of what the fleet's coverage arc, a location chosen because it was the farthest from all 11 vessels and therefore the least likely to be actively monitored, required a launch profile that conventional rocketry couldn't produce without being detected. The solution was a cold launch system developed specifically for this mission, a magnetically accelerated rail platform positioned in the shadow of Earth's moon, oriented to fire along a trajectory that kept the probe behind natural bodies for the first 18 hours of its journey. The initial launch signature would register, if detected at all, as meteoroid ejecta. The probe had no active drive. Once launched, it would coast on a precision-calculated ballistic arc for 40 days, using 2 microcorrection burns of 0.3 seconds each to refine its approach. The team ran 2,200 trajectory simulations. In 97.3% of them, the probe arrived within acceptable parameters. In the remaining 2.7%, detection was possible at various stages of approach. 2.7% was considered an acceptable risk given the alternative, which was continuing to do nothing. The probe launched at 4:47 Universal Time Coordinated on a moonless night when the Keth fleet's nearest vessel was at maximum range from the relay station. The launch was conducted by a crew of 12 people, none of whom were told what the probe was carrying. They were told it was a communications technology test. The lie was not unkind, it spared them the weight of knowing. 40 days of waiting began. The death count on launch day was 7.2 million. During those 40 days the world was not still. The Keth's infrastructure suppression campaign had continued with mechanical regularity, 2 to 3 strikes per week, each one precise, each one dismantling another piece of the systems that kept large populations alive and connected. The death toll no longer rose in clean increments. It rose in surges as power failures cascaded into water system failures which cascaded into supply chain breakdowns which cascaded into the slow, invisible deaths that don't make dramatic headlines but fill morgues and hospitals and the private grief of families who will never be certain their loved one's death was connected to an alien weapon fired from orbit. International coordination had broken down in certain respects and hardened in others. 3 regional conflicts that had been dormant for years had reignited, opportunistically, in the shadow of the Keth crisis. 2 governments had collapsed. 8 organizations were operating at capacities they had never designed for. But something else was also happening, something quieter and harder to quantify. Humanity was adapting. Engineers in dozens of countries, without coordination, without central direction, acting on their own initiative and the imperative of the situation, had begun redesigning critical infrastructure to reduce satellite dependency. Distributed power microgrids, mesh communication networks, water treatment systems that could operate on manual protocols, supply chains rebuilt around land and sea rather than air. It wasn't fast enough to stop the dying. But it was real, and it was accelerating, and it was evidence of something that the Keth's arrangement proceedings had apparently not modeled: humanity's capacity for rapid distributed problem-solving under existential pressure. On day 31 of the probe's flight, a signals analyst in the Node 7 monitoring team flagged an anomaly. The Keth fleet's communication signatures had shifted slightly, a change in the timing offset between vessels that was small enough to be within measurement error but consistent enough across 12 hours of data to be statistically significant. The team debated for 6 hours. The shift could mean nothing. It could mean the fleet was undergoing routine recalibration. It could mean they had detected something. Or it could mean they were preparing for something. The shift was noted. The probe's trajectory could not be altered. Any active burn would generate a detectable signature. They could only watch and wait. Day 39. The probe was 200,000 kilometers from KRS-4, coasting on its final approach. The team had gone to continuous monitoring, no sleep rotations, everyone present or on call within 5 minutes. Dr. Shapiro had not left the facility in 11 days. Day 40. Approach confirmed. The probe's onboard systems had been dormant for the entire journey. No emissions, no active components, nothing that could be detected. Now they were brought online in a carefully sequenced power-up designed to mimic the emission signature of KRS-4's own maintenance cycles. The probe made its final approach. At 9:14 Universal Time Coordinated on day 40, the probe established proximity with KRS-4. The relay station was a compact structure, roughly the size of a shipping container, anchored to a small asteroid that had been redirected for the purpose. It rotated slowly. The probe matched its rotation and held position at a range of 40 meters. Then it waited for the transmission window. The Node 7 team had determined that KRS-4 sent its routine data packet to the fleet every 73 minutes. The synthetic pulse needed to be injected into that data packet, embedded in the transmission so that when it arrived at the fleet's network receivers, it would be processed as part of a trusted, authenticated data stream. The 73-minute cycle gave them one chance per attempt. If the first injection failed, if something was wrong with the pulse's encoding, if the authentication spoofing didn't hold, they would have 73 minutes to diagnose and correct before the next window. The models gave the first injection attempt a 91% success probability. 91%. A number that was reassuring in statistics and terrifying in practice when the stakes were 9 million dead and counting. At 10:41 Universal Time Coordinated, KRS-4 began its transmission cycle. The probe activated its transmitter for 0.8 seconds, a burst time to the microsecond to coincide with the station's data packet transmission. Then the probe went dark again. The signal was propagating at the speed of light toward the Keth fleet. Travel time to the nearest vessel, approximately 4 minutes 20 seconds. Travel time to the farthest, approximately 6 minutes 40 seconds. If the injection had worked, every vessel would receive the pulse within a window of about 140 seconds. The Node 7 team sat in complete silence. Dr. Shapiro was looking at the emission data feed from the Fleet Monitoring Network. At 10:47 Universal Time Coordinated, 6 minutes and 12 seconds after the probe's burst, the Fleet Monitoring Network registered a change. Not an explosion. Not a flash. Something quieter. The drive signatures of all 11 Keth vessels flickered simultaneously, a microsecond dropout in the propulsion timing output, the kind of thing that would normally be filtered as sensor noise. Then a second dropout. Then a third, slightly longer. Then the communications signatures changed. The timing offsets between vessels, the precise, locked rhythm that had defined the fleet's movements for months, became irregular. Then erratic. Then incoherent. The fleet, for the first time in the entire period of human observation, was not moving in coordination. Individual vessels began firing their drives in short, uncorrelated bursts, not maneuvering but correcting as if each node of the system was trying independently to re-establish the timing lock it had lost. The attempts made the incoherence worse, not better. Each correction triggered a new verification loop. The recursion was propagating exactly as the models had predicted. At 10:52 Universal Time Coordinated, 3 vessels simultaneously went dark. Drives offline, communications offline. By 10:54 Universal Time Coordinated, 7 were dark. By 10:56 Universal Time Coordinated, all 11. The monitoring network registered the final propulsion signature from the last Keth vessel at 10:56 and 34 seconds Universal Time Coordinated. Then there was nothing. 11 vessels. Each one between 800,000 and 2.1 million metric tons. Silent. Dark. Adrift. The team at Node 7 did not cheer. Several people cried, quietly, the kind of crying that has no particular emotional category because the moment contains too many things at once. Relief. Horror. Grief. A stunned, unprocessed disbelief that it had actually worked. Dr. Shapiro sat very still for a long time. Then he picked up the secured line to Geneva. He said 4 words. The fleet is down. He was wrong about one thing. Not wrong about the fleet. Wrong about what came after. He had assumed, as had most of the team, that the network failure would be clean, that the vessel systems would fail and that the outcome, however terrible, would be rapid. What the monitoring network showed over the next 6 hours was more complex, and in certain ways more difficult to watch. Some of the vessel's emergency systems, isolated, non-networked components, remained operational. Distress signals in a format no human could interpret. Propulsion attempts, incoherent and circular. One vessel drifted for almost 3 hours before its core systems failed completely. The crew of the Keth fleet did not die instantly. There were an estimated 73,000 of them, based on revised mass analysis. That number sat in every document, every debrief, every post-action analysis for years afterward. 73,000 individuals who had been part of something that killed 9 million humans, a number that included, by the final count, 4.2 million people who died not from direct strikes but from the cascading infrastructure failures that followed. The question of how to hold both numbers in the mind simultaneously, 9 million and 73,000, was not a mathematical problem. It was a moral one. And it did not have a clean answer. The death count, as of the day the fleet went silent, was 8.9 million. The dying continued for another 3 weeks as the last of the infrastructure failures resolved. The final certified count was 9,147,000. For 12 days after the fleet went dark, no one knew what to say. Not officially. Not publicly. Not even among themselves, in the secure rooms and encrypted channels where the people who had made the decisions were still meeting. The silence wasn't confusion. Everyone understood what had happened in the mechanical sense. The silence was the gap between an event and its meaning, and that gap was, for a time, simply too large to cross. The Keth vessels were still there. They would be for a long time. 11 hulks, adrift in the outer solar system, their orbits slowly decaying toward eventual encounters with the gravitational mechanics of the solar system over timescales of decades and centuries. Several were drifting toward Jupiter's gravitational influence. One was on a trajectory that would, in approximately 40 years, bring it into the inner system. Recovery teams were discussed theoretically within hours of the fleet going dark. The idea of boarding the vessels, of accessing their technology, their databases, their physical structure, was simultaneously the most strategically valuable option imaginable and one of the most operationally complex things humanity had ever contemplated. The vessels were intact mostly. They were dark, not destroyed. Whatever had been inside them, crew, equipment, records, technology, was potentially still there, in whatever condition 73,000 deaths and a complete system shutdown had left it. The first unmanned probe was dispatched to the nearest Keth vessel, Track 3, on day 19. It arrived on day 47. The imagery it sent back was not released publicly for 2 years. When it was finally declassified, the response was subdued, partly because the images were technically extraordinary but visually somewhat abstract, and partly because the public, by that point, had already moved on to arguing about everything else. The argument about everything else had, of course, begun almost immediately. The death toll, 9,147,000, was publicly confirmed on day 14, when the last infrastructure crisis zones had been stabilized enough for census organizations to compile regional totals. The number was not a surprise. Estimates ranging from 8 to 11 million had been circulating in public media for weeks. But confirmation carried a different weight than estimation. The confirmed number had a permanence that the estimates hadn't. The mourning was real and vast and complicated. It overlapped with anger in ways that were difficult to untangle. Candlelight vigils and protest marches and government resignation demands and spontaneous community reconstruction efforts all existed simultaneously in the same cities, sometimes on the same streets. The political landscape in several countries was unrecognizable within a month. Governments that had been slow to act, that had prioritized diplomatic engagement over defensive preparation, that had suppressed information or issued misleading statements, they faced consequences proportional to the depth of their failures and the tolerance of their populations. But the larger question, the one that the political churn couldn't address and wouldn't for years, was the question that Dr. Subramaniam had first articulated in her annotation months earlier, and that had never gone away. What came next? The Keth homeworld was somewhere. Other Keth were somewhere. The long arrangement, whatever it was, whatever other civilizations it had incorporated or destroyed, was somewhere. 47 previous arrangement proceedings had concluded. Humanity was the 48th. Had the 48th concluded? Or had it simply reached an unexpected result that would prompt a revised response? The honest answer was that no one knew. The signals team was monitoring continuously for any new transmission in the frequency ranges associated with Keth communication. For the first 14 months there was nothing. The silence was vast and offered no interpretation. Some argued the silence meant the threat was over, that the destruction of the fleet represented a decisive defeat that would deter further action. The Keth, whatever their capabilities, had now demonstrated that they could lose. That loss had costs. Those costs might, rationally, inform a reassessment of the long arrangement's approach to humanity. Others argued the silence meant the opposite, that they were regrouping, recalculating, preparing a response scale to meet a threat they had previously underestimated. 47 species before humanity had presumably not destroyed an arrangement fleet. Humanity's response was, from a Keth strategic perspective, a genuinely novel outcome. Novel outcomes in strategic thinking generally prompt escalation, not withdrawal. Both arguments were reasonable. Neither could be verified. The world had to make decisions anyway. The defense posture discussions that began within weeks of the fleet's destruction were the most consequential policy conversations in human history. There was now proof that humanity had one viable response to a Keth-scale threat, but it was a narrow one, dependent on specific vulnerabilities in a specific fleet architecture. There was no guarantee that the next fleet, if one came, would have the same architecture. There was no guarantee that the Keth wouldn't adapt. What was needed, the strategic consensus gradually concluded, was not a single clever solution but a genuine change in humanity's defensive posture in space, an acknowledgement that the solar system was not a backyard, not a frontier for peaceful exploration, but a strategic environment in which other actors existed with their own interests and capabilities. The transition from a civilization that had never seriously planned for extraterrestrial military threat to one that had was not clean or easy. It involved budget realignments measured in trillions. It involved new institutions, a unified planetary defense command, eventually, that took 4 years to negotiate and another 2 to actually become functional. It involved profound changes in how humans thought about space, no longer purely as a destination for scientific curiosity or resource extraction, but as a domain with a security dimension that could not be ignored. The technological uplift that came from studying the adrift Keth vessels was significant, though slower than popular imagination suggested. The first boarding team reached Track 3 in year 3. What they found was extraordinary and, in places, deeply alien in ways that resisted reverse engineering for years. Certain technologies were clearly identifiable in function but impenetrable in mechanism. Others were more accessible: material sciences, certain drive concepts, aspects of the network architecture that had been humanity's undoing in the first place, now studied carefully for what they could teach about resilience as well as vulnerability. The world that emerged from the first contact war, a name that felt inadequate and stuck anyway, was different in ways that went beyond policy and technology. The 9 million dead were mourned with a seriousness that shaped a generation. Memorials were built. Dates were designated. An international observance was established, not triumphant, not celebratory, but commemorative in the original sense. A holding of the weight, a refusal to let it be forgotten. But there was something else harder to name that had changed. The thin illusion, never fully believed but never fully surrendered, that humanity was alone in the universe, or that the universe was fundamentally benign, or that intelligence necessarily implied benevolence, that illusion was gone. In its place was something harder and clearer. A recognition that the universe was large and old and full of things that had made different choices, and that survival required engagement with that reality rather than retreat from it. It was not comfort, but it was clarity. Dr. Subramaniam wrote one final paper, published in year 4. It was a linguistic analysis of the Keth's original 43-page document, revisited in light of everything that had followed. Her conclusion was one paragraph. There is a sentence in section 12 that we parsed in 4 different ways during the original translation process and never fully resolved. I believe I understand it now. The most accurate rendering in context is this: a species that cannot be arranged is a species that cannot be predicted. Unpredictability is the one variable the long arrangement cannot absorb. The Keth did not stop their campaign because they ran out of weapons. They stopped because humanity did something their 47 previous proceedings had never encountered. It answered. Not with submission and not with a force they recognized as force. It answered with something they had no category for. I don't think they were afraid of us. I think they were, for the first time in 60,000 years, uncertain. And in their framework, uncertainty is the beginning of a different kind of conversation. No second fleet came in the first 5 years. Nor in the first decade. The monitoring continued. The preparation continued. The uncertainty continued. And humanity, for the first time in its history, looked at the sky not with wonder alone, but with the calibrated, wide-eyed attention of a species that had learned to take the universe seriously. 20 years after the fleet went dark, a second signal arrived. It was not from the direction the monitoring network had been most carefully watching. It was not in the frequency ranges associated with the Keth fleet's communication protocols. It came from deep in the galactic plane, a direction that put its origin point at minimum several hundred light-years away, probably more, and it carried a mathematical structure that the signals team initially thought was Keth in origin until the spectral analysis came back. It wasn't Keth. It was something else. Something using a different architecture, a different encoding baseline, operating in a frequency range that suggested either a very different technological tradition or a deliberate choice to transmit in a way that was distinguishable from the Keth signals humanity had spent 2 decades cataloging. The difference mattered. It was noticed. It was studied for 4 months before any government was briefed. The signal contained mathematics, sequence structures, ratio relationships, dimensional notation. The standard vocabulary of first contact communication, the framework humanity had now used twice in 20 years. But embedded in the mathematical structure, at a level of encoding that took the signals team's best analysts 3 weeks to recognize, was something else. A reference to the Keth. Specifically to the Keth's long arrangement, a term used that matched the acoustic and symbolic structure of the Keth's own usage closely enough to be unambiguous. And attached to that reference, a phrase that had no clean translation but whose meaning the team eventually converged on. We know what you did to the arrangement fleet. We want to understand how. The signal was still being analyzed when the second part arrived, 11 days later. It was longer, more structured, and it contained something extraordinary, a partial index. A list, fragmentary and incomplete, of what appeared to be civilizations. Some entries in the list were flagged with a symbol the team couldn't translate. Others carried a different marker. The team spent 6 weeks working on the symbology before a junior analyst named Tanaka Reiko, niece of Ambassador Yuki Tanaka, who had died in the infrastructure crisis in year 1 of the war, made a connection that no one else had. The flagged entries matched, in position and rough description, with the 47 species the Keth had mentioned in their document. The flagged marker appeared to mean something like concluded or resolved or, in the darkest possible reading, gone. The entries with the different marker were fewer. 8 of them. Including, clearly and unmistakably, a reference to the human solar system. That marker appeared to mean something like open or unresolved or, in the translation that the team ultimately settled on as most consistent with the surrounding context, still here. 8 civilizations in the galaxy, according to this index, were still here in some meaningful sense despite having encountered the long arrangement. Humanity was one of them. The implications took months to fully think through, and thinking through them changed things again, changed the frame within which all the decisions of the previous 20 years needed to be reevaluated. The Keth were not the apex of galactic civilization. They were a part, possibly a large and powerful part but still a part, of something larger. The long arrangement was real and it was old, and it appeared to have been contested in some form by others before humanity. The 8 still here civilizations were scattered across an enormous volume of space. Contact with any of them would take decades of signal travel time at minimum. Real dialogue would take generations. But the existence of the list, the knowledge that others had faced similar pressures and found their own ways through, was not nothing. It was, in fact, the first genuinely hopeful thing to emerge from first contact in 20 years. The response to the new signal took 18 months to prepare. It was not a simple mathematical sequence. It was a document, carefully constructed, multi-layered, drawing on everything the linguists and analysts had learned from the Keth Communication Archive. It acknowledged the reference to the arrangement fleet. It offered, in measured and precise language, a description of what had happened and why, framed not as a boast but as a factual account of a species responding to an existential threat with the tools available to it. And it asked a question. The question was Dr. Subramaniam's, the one she had first posed in her annotation on the Keth document and never stopped asking. Of the species in your index that are still here, how did they get there? Not the mechanisms. The choices. What did they decide to be in the face of what they faced? The signal was transmitted on the 20th anniversary of the fleet's destruction. The response, if one ever came, would take at least several decades to arrive. Possibly longer. That was acceptable. Humanity had learned patience as a survival skill. What does it mean to be the 48 species? Not the weakest, clearly not, given what happened to the fleet. Not the strongest, 9 million dead and a civilization that nearly collapsed under sustained infrastructure attack does not describe a strong species in any comfortable sense. Something else. Something that resists the easy categories of victor and victim, aggressor and defender, advanced and primitive. The soldiers and scientists and diplomats and engineers who lived through the First Contact War, those who survived it, talked about it for the rest of their lives in ways that were often contradictory. Some felt pride. Some felt shame. Some felt both simultaneously, in a combination that never fully resolved. The 9,147,000 dead could not be rationalized away. Neither could the 73,000 on the Keth fleet. The math of justified self-defense was not clean, and anyone who presented it as clean was selling something. What was clean was the decision to survive. Not to survive at any cost. That framing was dishonest, because there were costs that had been refused, options that had been set aside, lines that had been held even under the most extreme pressure. But to survive with enough of the thing that made survival worth having, identity, agency, the capacity to make decisions rather than have them made, that had been the implicit commitment, and humanity had kept it. The children born after the war grew up in a different world. They had never known the thin, unexamined comfort of a species that had not yet been tested. They knew, from the first time they looked at the stars with any real attention, that the stars looked back. That knowledge was not crushing. It was, in a strange way, clarifying. The planetary defense infrastructure that had been built in the war's aftermath, the early warning networks, the coordinated response systems, the investments in space-based deterrent capability, was operational and improving. It was not invincible. It was probably not sufficient against a truly determined escalation from a civilization with the Keth's resources and the long arrangements backing. The honest military assessment said so. Humanity's advantage was narrow, technologically dependent, and required continuous maintenance and development to preserve. But it existed. It had not existed before the war. The difference between a solar system that was a passive target and one that had a genuine, if imperfect, defensive posture was a meaningful difference. Not comfort, clarity. The Mars installations were rebuilt. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. The new habitats were designed with redundancy that the original structures hadn't had: isolated power, independent life support, hardened communication systems. The people who chose to live there chose it knowingly in a way the first settlers hadn't. That knowing changed the character of the settlement. Made it more serious, more deliberate. The asteroid belt research platforms came back online. The Deep Space Monitoring Network was rebuilt with 3 times the coverage and a completely redesigned sensor architecture. The decommissioned communication arrays were replaced with new ones that operated on multiple redundant systems. Humanity did not retreat from space. It went back to space differently. Perhaps most significantly, the First Contact War had produced, for the first time in human history, a genuine species-level project. Not a project shared by all humanity in equal measure. That level of coordination had never existed and likely never would. But a project understood by virtually every human society as shared in consequence, even if not in effort or contribution. The defense of the solar system. The maintenance of humanity's place as a still-here civilization. There was a phrase that emerged from the war, from the memorials, from the commemorative literature, from the culture that grew up around the event. It was not heroic in the Hollywood sense. It was quieter than that. It appeared on the base of the memorial in Geneva, in the corridor outside the room where the authorization had been signed, in the final line of the official record of the First Contact Diplomatic Council's last session. Read. We were assessed. We were found to be a variable. We declined to be resolved. It was not a boast. It was not a threat. It was a description, factual, measured, neither proud nor ashamed, of what had happened and what had been decided in the worst years in human history. The second signal's response would take decades to arrive. The monitoring continued. The preparation continued. And humanity, battered, diminished, fundamentally changed, still imperfect, still fractious, still capable of tremendous kindness and tremendous cruelty in equal measure, humanity continued. As it had, through everything that had come before. As it would, through everything that would come after. Still here.